Hey everyone, and welcome back to a bonus episode of Wednesdays with Watson. It is April, and it is Childhood Abuse Awareness Month, and we want to bring resources. And yes, we're still going to bring you those stories of hope and healing, but many of you who have followed my journey will be familiar with the trauma-informed counseling modality that has worked for me. Today we have Jeremy Fox, LPC, EMDRIA, which just means he is an EMDR-approved consultant. And so I would love to welcome Jeremy to the show today and to welcome you to this conversation as I fulfilled the request of many of you to help you understand EMDR and how that modality has worked for me. So first of all, Jeremy, I'd like to thank you for coming to the podcast. We met on that same app, Clubhouse, and we are all doing some good things on there. Welcome. Thank you for taking time on a Saturday to come onto my podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I am an EMDRI approved consultant. So EMDRIA is actually the EMDR International Association. So I'm an EMDRI approved consultant, meaning I can offer consultation to other EMDR clinicians, and I've been providing the therapy for a while, and have gone through extra certification beyond what we call basic trained or certified. So that's all that means. It's good to be here.
Well, and I'm so grateful for you. I learned so much from you you're just an amazing human being, but I always like to do a little bit of an icebreaker. So you're in Georgia. I was brought up in Jacksonville, which is, we all know is South Georgia, and strong memories as a child of the Florida-Georgia game. So you live in Georgia. Are you a Georgia fan?
Yes, I have to be quite blunt though. I'm originally from South Carolina. So, and then I lived in Colorado. I mean, I've lived all over. So yeah. I'm a bit of a traveler, I guess you could say, but I'm a Southerner for sure, a Carolina boy.
Yeah. Nothing that we can't tell in that voice for sure. Yeah. My family hails, if you will, from the Columbia area. Very good cousin that taught at Columbia University. Somebody went to South Carolina. So I feel you on that. Tell us a little bit, because I did not do you justice. You did a little bit at the beginning about, you told us your credentials. Where did you go to school?
Yeah, absolutely. And no, you did great. So I got an undergraduate degree at CU Denver in Colorado University of Colorado, Denver, CU Denver for short. Then my master's degree at Colorado Christian University. So that's my educational background.
Very cool, and very, very solid educational background. So let's just jump right into this. My podcast is a short one when I want to respect people's time. What made you pick your profession?
So I knew as a teenager that I really enjoyed psychology. And I think it was the fusion of the artfulness, the literary quality, because Freud was quite an author on top of being, I mean, his work is very theoretical and medical. And so kind of that combination of art and science, really, because I've always enjoyed English and writing as well. And when I went to school and in college, I realized that I really enjoyed clinical practice, because I had a class on clinical counseling methods, and this is undergraduate so 4-year college. I was deciding what route to go, and I had a really good mentor, and so I thought I narrowed it down from theoretical and just research stuff and to clinical, because I was kind of there's a fork. Everybody has to decide what they are more interested in when it comes to psychology.
Sure.
And so you don't really have you don't have to choose completely, because I've written an academic article as well, but I mostly do clinical practice with clients. So got me interested on that front. I mean, loved understanding attachment psychology as well. So.
Yeah. And we, as you know, we had a mutual buddy, Erica, who talked about the attachment psychology. And for my listeners who have not heard that, need to go back, because because attachment psychology in bringing awareness to childhood abuse is so huge. And so speaking of that mutual buddy, right. Yeah, Erica, that we had on the last podcast, she helped us understand what happens to a child's brain during trauma. I want to park somewhere with you on this question, though, because I've heard you say it many times. And as someone with PTSD and who was abandoned and neglected by a parent, I've often heard you say that neglect is a special kind of trauma.
Hmm.
maybe I'm misquoting you there, but can you
No, you're
explain
not.
can you explain to us what happens to a child's brain when they are neglected, and maybe even what, by definition, neglect is?
Yeah, I absolutely can do that. And I will tell you right now that I draw a lot on the work of Bruce Perry, Perry. He talks a lot about early childhood neglect. But um, from in infancy and early childhood, neglect impedes formation of neurological pathways essential to communication in the brain. Okay, I'm quoting from him. So, in particular, neglect has been shown to harm the frontal cortex, which is responsible for planning, decision making, and memory. And so, extreme neglect can actually make children's brains smaller. Not trying to scare people here, because there are ways through that. And as you can talk about with EMDR and changes in brain scans, there are certainly ways out of that. But lowered IQ, cognitive delays, difficulty with inhibiting behavior. Okay, I was speaking with someone on another podcast earlier about ADHD and trauma mimicking each other. So that inattentiveness and that scattered behavior is similar to both those diagnoses. But then so neglect can appear as ADHD symptoms, as you just heard, the behavioral inhibition part especially. So what we're talking about when it comes to neglect is to kind of dovetail with that attachment stuff, the lack of positive interaction from caregivers. Okay. Now, obviously, physical neglect in terms of not receiving your essential needs is 100% related to that. We're talking about that as well. There's different types
Sure.
of it. So physical, educational, emotional, children need brain stimulation. Okay. Nurturing the sort of mirror neuron activation of a mother in a child's face, right? A caregiver in a child's face. Medical neglect, not receiving proper health care. So those are different categories. But when I talk about it, it's usually on that front of attachment neglect, where there isn't a figure there that can act as that external psychobiological regulator, which is Alan Shore's term. So that's just a fancy term for someone who teaches you how to recognize your own emotions and to realize that the world can be safely navigated.
Right. And how we perceive it, because I was neglected in almost all of those categories. And as you mentioned, and is a beautiful segue into EMDR, because at 35 years old, as my listeners know, I had a complete nervous breakdown, ended up in the hospital, landed though with a therapist, and we were doing traditional talk therapy and maybe some therapies that I didn't know he was doing. But he went to school for me and for a Vietnam vet. That's how much he really believed in EMDR and the modality that we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Right before we did that, as you know this story, but my listeners may not, I had to have an MRI on my brain for some random unrelated reason. There were 9 lesions on my brain, most of them in that prefrontal cortex. And they were like, we're not really that concerned about it, but come back in 6 months. Well, that was right around the time that my therapist got certified as you are in EMDR. And so we just smiled and said, you know what, let's see what happens. And we did some hard work. And so that's where I definitely, and the spoiler alert on that is 6 months later, 5 of those lesions were gone after EMDR therapy. And so that is why it's so important for me to have you here with us today, because this is your modality. My listeners, as I mentioned, are not unfamiliar with it. You specialize in it. You're passionate about it. And this is going to be, your mic, 5 to 7 minutes explaining to people. I have people who want to understand the science and who just want to understand it on a practical level. And then thirdly, it's most people think it's woo-woo, crazy, out there. But my voice, I'm alive because of this therapy that you're going to explain. And so I want you to go at it. I love your passion for this. I'm alive because of it. And so please explain to us what EMDR is and why it's effective.
For sure, absolutely. So first off, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. And so to break that down, the EMs, the eye movements, were studied as a form of bilateral stimulation, BLS. Okay, that has a distracting effect on memory, on the client. We'll talk about that. Desensitization pertains to the fact that this is a therapy that desensitizes or takes away the responsiveness to a stimuli, in this case, traumatic memory. And the reprocessing element of EMDR, the R, is taking this traumatic memory, situating it in its proper place in the past as something that happened, was terrible, but is over, and that you overcame. So I'll first say that trauma can activate our limbic system and cause the fight, flight, or freeze response. Dissociation is very common in early childhood trauma, meaning your brain goes elsewhere, like you freeze and can't do anything. And that is a real, by the way, dissociating is an element that really kind of predicts later traumatic symptoms. Like when you're a child and you can't do anything, you feel trapped. That's a big deal, to put it mildly, and can cause later down the road that sort of continued dissociating from things that you might want to fight or flee or would be able to handle in a more adaptive way. But getting a little ahead of myself. So normally memories are consolidated and given context, by REM sleep, by slow wave sleep, but traumatic memories often defy that. Okay. They often come back as flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive memory symptoms, but bilateral horizontal eye movements have been shown to help metabolize memories. Okay. And there are different hypotheses for how this works. One of them involves like that it's a slow wave sleep type brainwave frequency illustrated in EEGs. But what we know is that EMDR is extremely studied. It's been studied for like the past 30 years. It has a lot of empirical backing. I mean, so the number of frequency of eye movements are dependent on like what a client can handle at the time. So traumatic memories are formed by just feeling overwhelmed in the moment. So the initiation of information processing via bilateral stimulation reconsolidates fragmented somatic memories into semantic form. Okay, semantic form. And there's something called the predictive processing model of EMDR, which credits the reset of hippocampal theta wave rhythms via eye movements and the recognition of present safety, okay, with the reintegration of these intrusive memories. Okay, Eric Chamberlain discusses that in one of his model. He has a model of predictive processing as related to EMDR, and there's quite a bit that goes into, like, there's something called the working memory hypothesis that's very well supported, that shows that when someone is distracted, okay, by the bilateral stimulation, which has the eye movement has most research, or tones, the audio tones have not as much research, to be quite blunt with you. Tactile stimulation back and forth is one that's highly studied as well, but that what we could say that it distracts that bandwidth. It taxes the bandwidth of your memory the same way that having a lot of tabs on your computer taxes the brain, okay, or taxes your computer. So what that can do is it can cause that emotional vividness of that memory to decrease, okay, while that awareness, what we call the orienting response of recognizing that you're present and safe in the moment, is activated. Okay, so there's a few different, so there's the orienting response hypothesis, the working memory hypothesis, and then viewing EMDR as resetting the theta wave rhythm. And that's some emergent research that's more recent by Eric Chamberlain. I talk about the fact that EMDR acts as a way of completing the task of unresolved trauma. Trauma creates a Zeigarnik effect, essentially, which is a focus on an incomplete task, the incomplete task of fleeing in this case, which is in line with Peter Levine's work.
And this is the article you wrote, by the way. Yeah.
Yes.
We'll put that in the show links.
For sure. Thank you. So the idea of wanting to go back. So when we are interrupted when doing something, we tend to form a memory on that, and it is more robust than memories for completed tasks. So Bluma Zeigarnik, that's what this Zeigarnik effect is named after. She observed that waiters would forget completed orders and remembered incomplete ones with greater acuity. So why is that? Well, it's a task that you've yet to complete. And so trauma often robs someone of that capacity to complete something. It leaves the feeling of a thwarted intention, I use a lot. And that's right in line with Peter Levine's idea of trauma as these unactualized intentions, as things that you couldn't have done. You wish that you could have fought back. You wish that you could have this, that, or the other thing. Okay. And so that lingers. And there's also a lot of science from Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score.
And it does keep the score.
It does. Yeah. So, and that sounds kind of, I want to be clear. What we're saying when we say physical memories of trauma is the memory pattern is stored when you have an extreme cortisol dump and memory that activates your fight, flight response, your limbic system. There's such a severe physical reaction and aversiveness stored with that memory that subsequent reminders activate that those physical sensations, because it's not a narratively stored memory, it's somatic implicit memory. So sometimes you'll have flashbacks without even knowing potentially why. EMDR helps with that because it helps to reconsolidate those memories from that somatic form into a narrative form, because it's being divided up. You're being distracted by the eye movement enough, and that's distracting and showing the brain. It's actually interrupting that memory enough that your brain there's a paradoxical effect. I posit in my paper that, wait a minute, I want to complete that. You're interrupting while I'm thinking about it. And so that harnesses some of the brain's own intrinsic motivation. So I really encourage clients, if you're viewing this as somewhat spurious or in some way kind of weird or an unorthodox therapy, be aware there's emergent research that playing, and we can attach a link to this article, but playing Tetris after viewing something visually traumatic visuals leads to people having less vivid memories of what they witnessed if they play it within 24 hours. Now, what's going on there? Well, you're doing something distracting that overwrites the visuospatial sketch pad in the mind that harnesses that, and you're essentially helping to integrate that memory, and you're not dwelling on it. It's done, it's in the past. So there's a lot of science now that's coming out about eye movement and doing things with the eyes in trauma.
Yeah. And one of the ways that my doctor explains it to me is that it takes away the uber pain from the memory. So when he and I are sitting down and reprocessing that memory. So for example, my very first EMDR session was on one of my domestic violence traumas. And we were doing the bilateral stimulation, and there's a bunch of stuff we don't have time to go to on this podcast. But one of the things is integrating a truth into my left linear part of my brain. Right. And so, so I'm telling him this story, and we're bilateral stimulating, and suddenly into my cognitive thought process comes 3 words: you deserved better. And so now every time I have a flashback, flooding memory to that, related to that, those 3 words pop in my brain: you deserved better. And so for those of you out there, and I am going to put, Jeremy has written an article on this. We could have hours of conversation about EMDR. It works. And I know that people out there wanted to know everything that you just told us and more. I do encourage you to click on his article in the show links, but this is a therapy that works. It's a therapy that works inside the faith space, which a lot of Christians out there think it's hypnosis, and they're attaching something to it that's not true. And so that does lead me kind of to my next thing that I wanted to talk to you about. And you said, yeah, Amy, I'll talk about this. And so, so my podcast, as you know, is for trauma survivors. On the podcast, I highlight 3 C's: church, community, and trauma-informed counseling. You've obviously brought that to us today. You did graduate from a Christian university, and so you know all the buzzwords that we use of why bad things happen: the broken world, the fallen man, bad things happen because, whatever, fill in the blank, right? So you went there. But this is by far, when I interact with people, the barrier to people that come to me to help for belief in God or even a higher power. The most common question is, where was God? Why did he let this happen to me? So I'm asking you this question as my friend, who I've actually never met, but has just been so encouraging to me on the places that we do interact. And I'm also asking you as a therapist. I don't want to use words like broken world or fallen world, because those are terms people don't understand. Do you believe, first of all, you went to a Christian university, but I'm not going to assume the answer to this question. Do you believe that a faith in something higher than us, for me, it's Jesus. I call him the star of my story. Do you believe that faith is important in trauma healing?
So I do. I'll explain that. It's kind of the answer may be a little surprising. I hope that people can understand that when I think the idea of free will and what can happen gets really misinterpreted. And I think people have this people's faith is not one size fits all. And people can have beliefs and they can be taught beliefs that are very damaging on a spiritual trauma level, where there's this idea that something had to happen to you. Just because God can use something to your benefit does not mean that you had to undergo some trauma. That's a very perverse way, I think, that people look at things and are taught to look at things. And then they think, well, if that's faith, then I'm out. So that's one thing. Like, I understand you're saying people don't know these terms. I think if they have faith or interested, they probably should check out like the explanations for the problem of evil, if that matters to them. If not, I mean, my clinical background includes a great deal of work with people of all varying backgrounds. And so, I mean, I'm looking at an article right here entitled "Purpose in Life Predicts Better Emotional Recovery from Negative Stimuli." Okay, you can attach that to the show description, because I will say, if you don't, what is faith? Okay, belief in something. What is belief in something? A meaning-making mechanism. So what is that? Well, you have to have some degree of sense-making or narrative structure. As you say, Jesus being the star of your story, it's very wonderful language, because there's a highly effective, researched and interesting therapy called narrative therapy. Okay, it involves helping people to develop thicker stories, it's called, versus thinner narratives that are more like, this happened to me, this is who I am, a few lines, like a poem of how negative, and like a short description of how horrible things are about you and your life. And so, but narrative therapy helps people to find elements, that find different highlights in life and center those and help to construct things out of moments of resilience and competence. And so if you don't have faith, then believing in some purpose and some overarching goal. Again, you see people on Twitter, you see people on Facebook, any kind of self-help experts, they will talk to you about having an overarching guiding purpose. And if you don't have that, if you don't have anything you truly care for, then there's going to be less of a capacity to anchor oneself into a positive lifestyle. And in times of distress, you need coping skills and overarching narratives to which you can cling. If whatever that looks like, I mean, then there's not as much. And that can be, you can have relationships that you live for. Lots of people will be very attached to children and or helping a parent, like whatever that looks like, there has to be some meaning.
Yeah.
That's not really optional to go through. If you think about it, it makes sense, right? Like when you feel that your purpose in life is challenged, that can be damaging on its own. And if you don't have one and you wonder what you're even worth, well, that gets into a fundamental belief that you don't have a function or a purpose, okay? And that's dangerous territory. And by the way, it's very interesting you bring up thinking that three-word phrase you had, because that sounds like it was a positive cognition in that installation phase of EMDR.
100%. Yeah, it absolutely was. And so, yeah, I appreciate that answer on faith, because there are many listeners that listen to my podcast that don't share my same faith, and that's not, I'm cool. I am so cool with that. But I do think that you putting it into a language that we understand, because what you've done for us today here, Jeremy, is, and what you do when I hear you speak every time, is teach. But behind that education and that teaching is this giant heart that you have. And so, and I just can't say enough about how much I appreciate you being here today. As I am grateful, because you have, like I said, helped us understand the science. And so I hope, Jeremy, that somebody under the sound of both of our voices have found some hope in trauma, even in what you just said, even in my story of EMDR working, even in your description of how effective it is, even in the article that you wrote that we're going to put in the show notes, even in that purpose article that you just wrote. I hope people found hope. But here's what I want to tell you. As a survivor of neglect abuse, I can speak very passionately about EMDR. I can speak very passionately about what you said about the special kind of neglect. Do you know, Jeremy, that I can't put together a puzzle and I often lose Tetris because I believe that was part of my brain that was damaged as a child, and we're working on through EMDR. Now I'm getting better at directions and stuff that spatially affects our brain because of EMDR. These are things we don't even have time to talk about. But I want to thank you for being here today. Do you have anything else to add before we close?
I would say that no matter where you are, no matter what you've been through traumatically, please be aware that there's help, that you're not too broken. There's nothing traumatically beyond what your ability to cope and bounce back and be resilient can do, and what something like EMDR can offer. EMDR, somatic experiencing. I use a somatic EMDR approach where I guide people through noticing what reemerges in their bodies, physically moving how they want to through that, and continuing with the EMDR. So for anyone interested, we can also we'll be posting a link to a description on it on the 8 phases, because that's important too. Like you can look at all of this before you decide to go into it or not. So
I will say too that for those of you listening from all around the world, that we have figured out how to do it over telehealth, over Zoom. Yes.
Yeah, I did that with people. And so if someone's not willing to do it, find another person, to be quite blunt.
Amen.
Go to emdria.org, type in the upper right corner, look for a therapist in your area, in your zip code, enter your city. A lot of therapists will give 10 to 15 minute free consultations. Don't be of the opinion that you're beyond help. There's also sliding scale fees. There's community mental health agencies where therapists are willing to treat you like people can get indigent care if they don't have any insurance at all. And EMDR is not something where you're going to be forced to relive the trauma over and over. And a good EMDR clinician is going to make you aware of the fact that they will go at your pace. Trauma-informed care means not being dumped into stuff right away, going at a pace that's reasonable. And so all of these things can meet you where you are at these objections, like, well, no, I'm too broken. Well, no, it'll be too overwhelming. No, there's a whole preparation phase in EMDR. It's the second phase. It's very early on.
And it's safe if you find the right place. And of course, everybody knows where they can reach me. Here's where I want you to tell us where we could reach you, because I 100% expect to be calling you Dr. Fox one day. You are the trauma tamer. I love that you put that on Twitter. But I'd love for you to tell us everywhere we can find you, all the places, Clubhouse, and wherever you want people to find you, because you have so many resources, many of which we will put in the notes.
Sure. You can find me. My handle is at Fox Therapy LLC on Instagram and Twitter. Okay. I have a podcast called Fox Takes. That's also the name of my YouTube channel. I have been on Clubhouse more recently. I got a huge backlog of podcast episodes people will enjoy. I've been on Clubhouse. My name on there is Fox Therapy, all one word. I'm probably going to start recording some Clubhouse dialogues as podcasts just to reach everybody. That's kind of a thing I've been experimenting with. People can email me, foxemdrtherapy@gmail.com if they want to do that. My disclaimer would be this has all been very psychoeducational. I am actively clinically practicing, but therapists, we only practice where we're licensed. And that's usually the state where we're located. I'm licensed in 2 states because I'm keeping my license in Colorado active, but I'm not, right now I'm starting a new clinical job. So I'll probably, I wouldn't be able to take people from out of state, and B, probably, I'm going to probably stick to my job for accepting clients. So I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to troubleshoot with people if I have time, to chat about EMDR and trauma healing.
Yeah, and definitely if you're on the Clubhouse app, and that is coming for Androids,
absolutely,
you are going to want to follow Jeremy's club as well, called Trauma and EMDR, I believe is what we called it. Yes.
Yes, that's one. And then I would say I have a club that's a little bigger right now called Building an Unhackable Brain, which is all about what it sounds like, developing resilience. And that's a whole different conversation about how people who have supportive communities and identity can withstand trauma better than with fewer side effects and without having the same traumatic memory intrusions, flashbacks, etc., as someone who doesn't. So resilience and all that stuff. So yeah, follow me on there.
I need to follow that club. I have not done that, but
I think I added you to it.
I think, you know what, you did.
You're probably in it.
Well, Jeremy, thank you for being here today. I will see you around the club. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, as always, for spending time with us today. If you found value in what you heard, please consider sharing this episode. We will be back next week with a story of hope, hope that looks different, but a miracle nonetheless. We are not going to stop fighting. While you are in your app right now, click on my Instagram handle. There you will find a month-long challenge to reclaim, as you watch me reclaim my childhood by doing things that could possibly land me in the ER before the end of the month. You'll find some comic relief, and it will remind you of this month's mission, to shed light on childhood abuse, because there is no excuse for childhood abuse. As our guest has told us today, there is hope, even when that happens. As Phil Baker's song plays us out, may it still be true that my life, though traumatic, be one marked by the only one that gives me sustaining hope. Let it continue to be the healing zone. Until next time, let the healing continue.
So let my life glorify you.